Wathey will offer an explanation for this and other puzzles of religion in terms of cognitively impenetrable illusion, one that science has largely overlooked. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to our speaker.
All right, thank you very, very much. Give me just a second to share a screen here. Okay, I believe that should be working now. Well, thank you for the introduction, and my special thanks to everyone who put this event together. I know it takes a lot of work. It's an honor to be with you today. And some of you might recognize this image. It's a local one to you. I found it on the internet. You have a very beautiful botanical garden. And give me just a second to try to get these slides to move. Okay. By coincidence, we're meeting on the anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. The perpetrators of those attacks were acting on false beliefs. And as I'm sure you know, prominent freethinkers have tried hard to tear down some of those delusions. Those terrorists were acting out of, not only out of beliefs, though, they were acting out of primal rage, something deep in human nature, something that has a powerful grip on the human mind. Those false beliefs were merely a superficial manifestation of that. My talk today is not about terrorism, but it is about that powerful grip on the human mind. Other scientists have tried to explain religion, but I have long felt that there was something important that was being overlooked. That something is what I call the illusion of God's presence, and that's our subject for today. My talk will be in 4 parts. In part 1, I'll try to show through example what I mean by the illusion of God's presence. In part 2, I'll present some insights from the science of visual illusions that we'll need later in the talk. Now, you may wonder what any of this has to do with religion, but be patient. I think you'll see the relevance in part 3 when I try to explain the illusion of God's presence as something intrinsic to human nature. My hypothesis makes testable predictions, and we'll turn to behavioral biology and neuroscience for some insights and evidence here. Of course, any good hypothesis should have explanatory power. So in part 4, I'll show how it explains 3 long-standing puzzles of religion, one of which was pointed out by Neil deGrasse Tyson. So that's the map of where we're going. Now let's go on to part 1. I said that the illusion of God's presence is something science has mostly overlooked. So to give you some context, I should first say a little about what science has studied about religion. Science has mostly explored those aspects that contribute to human social behavior. And of course, this is an extremely important dimension of religion. From it, we get such things as belief in judgmental gods, greater cooperation within the in-group, greater hostility toward competing out-groups, rituals of sacrifice as proof of belief and loyalty, and group rituals that get believers moving and feeling as one. In my book, I lump all of these things together into what I call the social root of religion. But the illusion of God's presence comes from somewhere else. In this painting, the artist depicts it in a visual way because that's just kind of what artists do, but it's really not a visual hallucination. It's more a compelling feeling that someone else is nearby, coupled with intense emotions. And I can best convey the illusion just by reading you some first-person accounts. They seem to fall into 2 big categories, one of which involves a feeling that comes on gradually and persists, possibly for a lifetime. It may be a vague sense that the universe is somehow mindful and benevolent, or an ongoing feeling of God's love and presence. Here's how blogger Andrew Sullivan describes it. I have never doubted the existence of God, never. My acceptance of God's existence, of a force beyond everything and a source of everything, goes so far back in my consciousness and memory that I can neither recall finding this faith nor being taught it. It is the air I have always breathed. And then there's the sudden and transient kind. Often these come in times of personal crisis or helplessness. This anonymous example comes from a collection of thousands of such reports. Then, just as I was exhausted and despairing, I had the most wonderful sense of the presence of God. He was in a particular place in the room, about 5 feet from me. I didn't look up, but kept my head in my hands and my eyes shut. There was a feeling of an all-embracing love which called forth every ounce of love I had in me. It was the tenderest love I have ever encountered, and my sins were blotted out completely. So note the strong emotions here and also the spatial specificity of the illusion in a particular place at a specific distance. There's also typically an overwhelming feeling of knowing or sense of certainty that comes with these experiences, and this can be so compelling that many people take it as evidence for God's existence. One of those is Christian apologist William Lane Craig. I know Christianity is true on the basis of the witness of the Holy Spirit in my heart. This gives me a self-authenticating means of knowing Christianity is true, wholly apart from the evidence. Similarly, Francis Collins, director of the NIH, makes essentially the same point, but with a rhetorical question. Why do we have a God-shaped vacuum in our hearts and minds unless it is meant to be filled? Now, some of you will recognize this as just a plain old God of the gaps argument. We don't understand these feelings. Science could never explain this. Therefore, God did it. The problem with this is that it doesn't really explain anything. It's untestable. It suggests no experiments. It's an intellectual dead end. Now, I'm not challenging the reality of the feelings. I've had those myself. But I just see them as a fascinating puzzle of human nature that cries out for a scientific explanation. We'll get to that in a few minutes, but first we need some insights from visual illusions. Illusions happen when a neural model differs from reality. In the Ames rim illusion, the identical twins appear grossly different in size because the brain has an internal model of rectangular rooms with horizontal floors and parallel walls. Now, if you look into this room with both eyes, the illusion instantly vanishes because your depth perception reveals the true shape of the room, which is not rectangular. But as long as you look with only one eye, you see the illusion, even if you completely understand how it works. This is what psychologists call cognitive impenetrability. Our conscious understanding of the reality of the situation is not enough to penetrate the illusion. This illusion comes from a different neural model. Is this a meaningful image or just some random blobs? Most of you will probably see only randomness here, but that is the illusion. There really is some meaning here, some surprising and truly vivid meaning, but you could stare at it for hours and never see it unless I do this. And for some of you in the audience, it will help if I make this, the image a little smaller, so I'll do that too. So now I'd like your feedback on this. If any of you see something meaningful in this, just shout it out and let me know through whatever means you have there. Anybody see anything in this?
It's a woman's face.
Excellent. Okay, at least one person is seeing a face in this. There may be a few people who are having trouble, however, because this is a rather difficult one to work out. So I'm going to give some hints just in case there's anybody who hasn't yet figured it out. I'm going to move over here with my little cursor arrow. It's a woman's face in profile, and she's looking to the right. My little cursor arrow here is now at her eyebrow. This is her eyebrow. This is her eye. And I'm outlining her nose here, which is partly in shadow. Her mouth is open in a broad smile. Those are her lips right there. And now I'm tracing the outline of her chin, and that's her neck down there. So I hope that will make that a little easier to interpret for the rest of you. This thing is called a Mooney face, after psychologist Craig Mooney, who used images like these to study perception in the 1950s. It's a grossly impoverished image, stripped of all color, shades of gray, and most spatial detail. when I had it upside down, I was making reality differ from your neural model of a face, which evidently expects faces to be upright. And even though most of you can see the face, you'll probably lose that percept, or at least it will become much weaker if I turn it upside down again. And there are two important lessons here. One is that this is yet another example of cognitive impenetrability. Excuse me just a minute. We've got a problem of this menu up at the top. I'm going to try to make that go away by moving my cursor off the screen. Okay, so one lesson is that this is cognitive impenetrability again. We have trouble seeing this face in this image, even if we, when it's upside down, even if we know it's there. But if we turn it right side up, our neural model fleshes out this stripped down picture, and we get a much more vivid percept of the face. And that's the second lesson. Perception comes not only from sensory input, but also from what the brain expects. And when the sensory input is impoverished, those expectations of the brain's internal models become much more important. Of course, if the image is not impoverished, it's easy to see upside down faces, and many of you will recognize this as Margaret Thatcher. Now, if you study these images carefully, you'll see some slight differences, but overall they look fairly similar. And that is the illusion. Here's what they really look like. The only difference here is that the eyes and the mouth have been turned upside down in this image on the left, but that's enough to make her a hideous ghoul. And because Margaret Thatcher's face was the first one to be abused in this way, the illusion is named in her honor. What this tells us is that there's a special purpose circuit in the brain for the holistic processing of upright faces, and our perception of the normality of a face and its emotional impact are absolutely dependent on that circuit. We are utterly blind to the ghoulishness of Margaret Thatcher's altered face if it's upside down. What the illusion cannot tell us, though, is whether this special purpose circuit is innately specified or is the product of experience. After all, we almost never see upside down faces. Maybe the brain is lousy at perceiving them because it just hasn't seen enough of them. So is holistic face perception innate or learned? Well, there's a good way to find out. Twin studies are the gold standard for teasing apart innate versus learned aspects of perception. Identical twins share 100% of their genes, but fraternal twins only 50% on average. So if identical twins are significantly more alike in their face perception abilities than are fraternal twins, then that's compelling evidence of a genetic contribution. Now, to do this twin study, we need tests of face perception that give us numbers, and luckily there are some. I don't have time to explain these, but all you really need to know is that they are sensitive tests of holistic face perception that give numerical scores. The twin study found a strong genetic contribution to holistic face perception. About a third of the variance across individuals comes from genetic factors. We even know where this circuit is in the brain because damage to the fusiform gyrus, shown here in red, causes profound face blindness or prosopagnosia. And it's not the whole area in red here that matters for face perception. If these two little red spots called the fusiform face area are damaged, you get face blindness. Now, it's a little misleading to call it face blindness because people who have it can still tell you they're seeing a face if you show them a picture of a face. But what they cannot do is tell you whose face it is, even if it's a famous person or a close family member. Also, the deficit is permanent. No other part of the brain can learn to take over the role of the damaged fusiform face area. The astonishing thing, though, is that the face blindness is permanent, even if the damage happens in a one-day-old infant. This paper I'm citing here describes a teenage boy who suffered a stroke that destroyed the fusiform face area when he was 1 day old. He had profound and permanent face blindness, although his recognition of non-face objects was much less impaired, and that's fairly typical in these face blindness syndrome cases. But what's astonishing about this particular case is that infancy is the time when the brain is most plastic, when the function lost to local damage can often be taken over by some other area of cortex, but not if the damage is in the fusiform face area. What this means is that the fusiform face area is an extremely brittle, single-purpose, innately specified circuit for which no other part of the brain can substitute, despite the fact that this thing is a learning machine. The whole purpose of the fusiform face area is to learn to recognize thousands of individual faces over the course of a person's lifetime. So it's not like there's no synaptic plasticity going on in this thing. It's extremely plastic. All it does is learning. That's what it's for. But it's a highly specialized kind of learning. And that's the important point I'm trying to get across here. Highly specialized learning of this kind requires a foundation of innate knowledge. And that insight suggests a question. Can a newborn infant use any of this innate knowledge about faces? Well, it turns out they can and do. Newborn infants have some holistic face perception ability. They spend more time looking at an upright moony face than one that's upside down. Also, they prefer a moony face to a similar non-face image. And we know from a clever habituation test that they see these two images as the same, but they see these two as different. So the human brain expects to see faces. That expectation is partly innate, and it's up and running at birth. This neural expectation makes us extremely sensitive to faces, and that's normally a good thing. We need that sensitivity to see mood and intention in the faces of other people, for example. And even newborn infants may have some rudimentary ability to do that. The evidence for this comes from studies of neonatal imitation, like the one I'm showing here. Under the right conditions, a newborn will spontaneously imitate the face of an adult model. Now, this is a subtle phenomenon. It takes careful observation and statistics to demonstrate it. And although it has been widely replicated, there is still some, some controversy about it in the scientific literature. Let me get a drink here. But overall, the evidence is overwhelming that newborns are highly sensitive to faces, and of course, adults are also. In fact, our face expectant cortex is so sensitive that it sometimes makes us see faces that aren't there at all. And I'm sure you've all had that experience. We can see faces in the clouds, in trees, rocks, shadows. We can see faces almost anywhere. And this is one of my favorite examples. This is the famous face on Mars, photographed by the Viking 1 orbiter in 1976. The little black dots are data dropouts. They're not real. But one of them happened to fall in just the right place to make a compelling nostril. That accident, along with the way the shadows happened to fall, made this otherwise unremarkable mesa look enough like a face that our fusiform face area instantly sees it that way. Here's that same mesa as seen years later by the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter using a much higher resolution camera. But I've deliberately blurred the image here to give it about the same low resolution as in the old image, which you can still see down in the corner. Now, of course, in this new image, the nostril is gone and the shadows are a bit different. But if you try hard, you might still be able to see a face in this, especially if you use the old image as a hint. But if we get rid of the blurry low resolution and go to high resolution, then it becomes obvious that this face exists only on Mars and not in our, exists only in our brains and not on the surface of Mars. So now let's quickly go over the main points I'd like you to remember about illusions. Perception comes not only from sensory input, but also from what the brain expects. The brain takes shortcuts in its internal models to improve performance at critical perceptual tasks. And one of those shortcuts could be, for example, the assumption that faces are going to be upright. Illusions happen when a neural model differs from reality, and it may be a shortcut in the model that makes it differ from reality. Learning often requires a foundation of innate knowledge, as we saw in the fusiform face area. Twin studies are the gold standard for teasing apart innate versus learned aspects of perception and behavior. And finally, the brain's expectations can make us perceive things that aren't there at all, like the illusory face on Mars. So now we can tackle the illusion of God's presence and my explanation of it. What exactly is this? What aspect of reality is the brain trying to model here? What causes the illusion? And how does it compare to the visual illusions we've just been looking at? When I try to explain this in terms of biology and evolution, I often get the objection that religion comes from indoctrination. So my hypothesis must be wrong. This evolutionary or biological approach just can't possibly be right. So let's get this objection out of the way first. There are two lines of evidence that religion is partly a biological thing. One is the observation from anthropology that religion is a cultural universal. And the other comes from twin studies, our gold standard, which find that religiousness is significantly heritable. Roughly half the variance in religiousness across individuals comes from genetic factors. But if religion is partly a product of evolution, then why would natural selection favor this? Well, my short answer is that it doesn't. It favors something else that makes us vulnerable to this illusion. And I think there's a completely natural explanation for the illusion of God's presence, one that has to do with the peculiar constraints of human infancy. And I think the neonatal brain is expecting something godlike, but that something isn't God. And we can see a hint of what it really is expecting in the Moreau reflex, shown here in the image below. This is an infantile startle reflex that's thought to be a vestige from our primate ancestors. They would have to cling to their mother's fur, and whenever they were jostled or startled, they had to reflexively reach out and grab on tight. I think you'll agree it bears a striking resemblance to Pentecostal prayer. This is just one of many examples of what I call the infantile or neonatal root of religion, which I believe can account for the illusion of God's presence. In contrast to the social root of religion, the neonatal root is characterized by belief in a God of unconditional love, maternal compassion and caring, infantilism in religious feeling and ritual, intense spiritual longing, and the illusion of God's presence. This kind of religiousness appears to be a byproduct of the selective pressures for the survival of helpless infants. And I formalized this idea as a hypothesis that has three parts. Let's see. Sorry here, I'm just having a little trouble with my clicker here. Okay, sorry about that. Part one is that a newborn infant has an innate neural model of its mother. Now, this is not a detailed image of a specific person, but only a sense of the existence of some vague and amorphous primordial savior out there somewhere. And here are the essential elements of the model as I conceive it. A newborn infant knows that its mother exists, that she knows how to help the infant, that she is able to help, wants to help, and will help when she hears crying. Now, there's a bit more to it than that. There's also some physiologically critical information about the mother providing nourishment through nipples that can be recognized by scent and touch and taste, about her having a melodic voice, a feminine pitch, and about her having some rough idea of what a face is and what it looks like. And on the left here, you can see what a mother's face does look like to a newborn with its still developing visual system. This is an impoverished image, sort of like a Mooney face. So you can see how it would be helpful for an infant to have some capacity for holistic face processing. Well, I am suggesting that they have more than that, especially in the cortex that will ultimately be dedicated to social behavior in adulthood. But in infancy, it supports the attachment to mother, the primordial savior. So that's part one of the hypothesis. Part two is that the circuitry that implements this innate model of the mother persists into adulthood, but normally lies dormant. And part three is that the existence of this circuitry in the adult can give rise to the illusory feeling of a loving presence, especially, though not necessarily, under conditions that mimic the helplessness of infancy. And these feelings are often interpreted in religious terms because a crude mother-shaped vacuum is easily misperceived as a God-shaped vacuum. This hypothesis is consistent with what we know about the newborns and hatchlings of many vertebrate species. Having some kind of innate knowledge is the rule, not the exception. A good example are the herring gull chicks studied by Nico Tinbergen. They have an innate visual model of the parent's head and bill, especially that prominent red spot near the tip. They peck at that spot to solicit feeding, and newly hatched chicks will do this without any prior experience. Now, Tinbergen found that the chicks would also peck at artificial models of the bill. And if he exaggerated thinness, redness, and contrast near the tip, he could make a stimulus that was even more effective than the natural one. This is a classic example of what ethologists call a supernormal stimulus. And in much the same way, I suggest that God is a supernormal stimulus for the innate neural model of mother. God is a kind of superparent who answers prayers, is perfectly loving, omnipotent, and omniscient. These exaggerated attributes excite that crude model of a mother even better than a real mother does. And when it's excited, the innate certainty of the mother's existence feeds the certainty of God's existence and the illusion of his or her sensed presence. Another useful metaphor here is the illusory phantom limb of the amputee. The phantom limb happens because the brain of an amputee expects the missing limb to be there, and that neural expectation creates the illusion. The patient's conscious knowledge that it's an illusion doesn't make it go away. Now, I really like this metaphor because if you combine it with the previous one, you get a nice, catchy phrase. In the light of biology, the God of unconditional love is a supernormal phantom, not a supernatural spirit. More specifically, God is a supernormal stimulus in the ethological sense to the innate model of mother, and God's presence is a phantom sensation in the neurological sense, because the innate model expects a primordial savior to be there, just as the brain of an amputee expects the missing limb to be there. And this similarity of the phantom limb and the sensed presence is more than just a metaphor. Both the phantom limb and the sensed presence are illusions of embodiment, one's own in the case of a phantom limb, or someone else's in the case of a sensed presence. And there's an interesting part of the brain called the temporoparietal junction that's involved in both of these illusions. I think this is likely to be one of several places in the brain where the innate model of mother is implemented, but it's not the whole thing. If you stimulate this area with electrical current, the subject may experience the illusion of a sensed presence, though seldom with any kind of religious interpretation. The spatial and the personal aspects of it are there, but the unconditional love usually isn't. Those feelings of divine love may, however, come from this place. This is the orbitofrontal cortex, which I think is also likely to be an essential part of the innate model of mother. It's on the underside of the frontal lobes, just above the eyes. Now, of course, it's what the orbitofrontal cortex does that makes it interesting. In monkeys, we know it's important for reinforcement learning. Neurons in the orbitofrontal cortex learn to become excited by a previously neutral stimulus, like, for example, green, like a green triangle on a computer screen, but only if that green triangle is paired with a tasty treat. The tasty treat is called a primary reinforcer because it is innately rewarding, and the triangle becomes a secondary reinforcer only with learning. And by the way, the encoding of primary reinforcers in this part of the brain appears to be yet another example where innate knowledge serves as an essential foundation for learning. Now, we also know from neural imaging experiments that the orbitofrontal cortex is specifically activated in human parents when they see infants, and in infants when they hear their mother's voice. So it's this last finding, and of course, a bunch of others similar to it, that are most relevant to my hypothesis of the innate model of the mother. But all three of the findings I've shown here, the reinforcement learning, the parent's response to the infant, and the infant's response to the mother, all of these things taken together strongly suggest that the innate model of the mother, or at least the part of it that's in the orbitofrontal cortex, can be thought of as the set of primary reinforcers needed for learning human social behavior. This could explain why the innate model persists into adulthood. It persists because it forms an innate foundation for learning. Primary reinforcers like gentle touch, a smiling face, an affectionate tone of voice, all of these are rewarding and drive us to connect with others, not only in infancy, but throughout life. And the most compelling evidence for this comes from the observation that damage to the orbitofrontal cortex in humans causes a syndrome called acquired sociopathy. Now, in this syndrome, cognitive abilities are normal. Memory, language, math skills, logical reasoning, all of that stuff is fine. The problem is that these patients can't feel the emotional consequences of reward and punishment. They lack gut feelings. Also, they can't anticipate how their actions affect others, so they are devoid of empathy. And because of these deficits, they make terrible decisions, though not usually rising to the level of criminality. But for example, they lose their jobs, they make stupid investments, they go bankrupt, they get divorced, they marry prostitutes. In short, their lives fall apart. Interestingly, though, the syndrome is most severe when the damage occurs in infancy. As children, these patients are disruptive and impulsive in school. They're always getting in trouble for pathological lying, aggression, and stealing. They have poor hygiene and bizarre diets. They practice careless sex starting in their early teen years, and they make dangerously negligent parents. What this tells us is that the orbitofrontal cortex is an extremely brittle, innately specified circuit for which no other part of the brain can substitute. And that should sound familiar to you because we have seen this movie before. This is exactly the kind of thing we saw earlier in the fusiform face area. And like the fusiform face area, this innately specified thing is a learning machine. Well, this is all very fascinating and says a lot about my hypothetical innate model of the mother. But does the orbitofrontal cortex have anything to do with feeling God's presence? It should, if my hypothesis is right. Unfortunately, though, this is a tough experiment to do because ideally what you'd like to do is to scan the brains of people in that critical moment when they're having the sudden and intense kind of feeling of God's presence. But as you might imagine, that's a little hard to summon on demand. But if there is anyone who could do this, or who at least could come close to doing it, it would be these people, the Carmelite nuns of Montreal. They spend much of their time seeking closeness to God. And this image I'm showing here comes from their website where it had a caption that read, "God lives, I stand in his presence." Well, luckily, Montreal also has neuroscientists, and they persuaded 15 Carmelite nuns to be subjects in a brain scanning experiment. Their neural activity in a mystical state was compared to that in a baseline condition, resting with their eyes closed. In the mystical condition, the subjects were asked to remember and relive with their eyes closed the most intense mystical experience ever felt in their lives as members of the Carmelite order. And to give you some clue about what kind of mystical experience we're talking about here, I'd like to read you a direct quote from the paper. During the qualitative interviews conducted at the end of the experiment, several subjects mentioned that during the mystical condition, they felt the presence of God, his unconditional and infinite love, as well as plenitude and peace. So that's pretty good. That sounds close to what we're looking for. So the interesting question is, what was happening in the brain during all of this? Well, the paper listed 14 brain areas specifically active in the mystical state relative to baseline, but I will show you just the top 5. And at the very top of the list, the most active is the orbitofrontal cortex. So that's encouraging. I don't have a specific interpretation for the next one in the list, the middle temporal area. But the next 3 after that, in the inferior and superior parietal lobules, those are all in or near the temporoparietal junction. That's the area I showed you earlier that's involved in embodiment, where direct electrical stimulation can elicit the illusion of a sensed presence. Now, I want to stress that all of this is merely suggestive. It does not prove my hypothesis, but it is at least consistent with it. Okay, so let's quickly go over the main parts, the main points I'd like you to remember from this part of the talk about my hypothesis. First of all, religion is partly a biological thing. There's a neonatal root of religion that science has largely overlooked. God's presence is an illusion in high-order association cortex that retains an innate model of mother. In the light of ethology and neuroscience, God is a supernormal phantom, not a supernatural spirit. And finally, the hypothesis of the innate model of mother leads to some testable predictions, and we saw some evidence for one of them in the orbitofrontal cortex. Of course, a good hypothesis may also explain some long-standing puzzles, and we have time to look at 3. Puzzle number 1. Why is God two-faced? Why do believers tell you their God will damn you to hell, yet in the same breath insist that he loves you unconditionally? Well, you probably already know my answer to this. They are blind to this blatant contradiction because of powerful intuitions from the social and neonatal roots of religion, which tell them that both descriptions of God must be true. Now, if I'm right about this, if these really are the dominant sources of religious emotion, then this insight applies to more than just the two-faced God. It means that religion is in some fundamental sense two-dimensional. If we mix the social and neonatal ingredients in the right proportions, we should be able to cook up just about any kind of religiousness there is. Or to put it a little more precisely, if we could measure how much a person's belief comes from the social and neonatal components, then we could plot anyone in this space. Now, in my book, I include a rough draft of a psychometric test that tries to do exactly that. The latest version of it has 44 items that assess the 10 qualities in these 2 lists. And each item in the test is a statement that probes one of these aspects of religiousness, and respondents indicate their levels of agreement. And I'm pretty sure you've all seen psychometric tests of this kind. Here's just one example. For a statement like this one, teachers should lead prayer in public schools. The standard way of indicating your level of agreement works just fine. But what about this one? God will never abandon me. The statement assumes that God exists and probes absolute trust in that God. Now, for an atheist like me, that's a bit confusing. If I say I disagree, I seem to be saying, well, yeah, there is a God, but I just don't trust him. It's almost like being asked, have you stopped beating your wife? So to eliminate some of that kind of confusion, I add one more option, which I show here on the left, for those who feel that the statement just doesn't apply to them. And with that little fix, you have already a pretty good idea of what this test is, and I've shown you a couple of examples, but I'd like to show you a few more just to give you a better feel for what's really being measured. So let's start with the social dimension. For example, items that probe divine judgment include God rewards the righteous and punishes the wicked. Hell is a real place where sinners and unbelievers are punished. And at times I have been fearful of God's wrath. And as you might imagine, let's go to another one, probing sacrifice. People who don't contribute money at religious services should stop coming. I would gladly give my life to defend my faith. And I would rather my child die than lose his or her faith in God. Now, the first one in the list here seems pretty tame compared to the other two, and that last one is so extreme. You might think that no parent could possibly feel that way, but I assure you some do. That's actually an almost exact quote from a Christian mother. But now let's go over to the other side of religion, the neonatal dimension, where the items look very different. First, probing infantilism. I sometimes think of God more as a loving mother than as a heavenly father. I feel safe in God's arms, and we are all God's children. And now probing the feeling of God's presence. God lives in my heart. God always answers my prayers. I know God is real because I have felt his presence. So that should give you some idea of what this psychometric test is all about. But the main point I want to make here about the test is that you should think of it as a prediction. These two dimensions of religiousness should really exist, not just on paper, but in the minds of the people who take the tests. And psychologists have a good mathematical tool for getting at just this kind of question, which they call this tool factor analysis. What I'm predicting here is that if my psychometric test is given to many different subjects of diverse religious backgrounds, then the social and neonatal items should naturally segregate into these two distinct factors in a factor analysis. That would mean that they correspond to something real in the human mind. And so far, unfortunately, that experiment has not been done, but it should be. Okay, let's move on to puzzle number 2. Why are women more religious than men? This is probably the single most robust finding in the psychology of religion across nearly all religions, and by most measures of religiousness. Women are significantly more religious than men on average. Now, of course, we're talking here about averages. There are many exceptions in the individual cases. But on average, the only significant exception to this is in the frequency of attending worship services, where the gender gap is kind of a mixed picture. These data come from the Pew Research Center, and shown in orange are the 30 countries in which significantly more women than men attend weekly religious services. In blue are the countries in which men predominate. In gray are the countries in which there is no significant gender gap, and countries in white were not surveyed for this question. Now, it turns out that what's going on here is that in predominantly Muslim countries, a social norm requires that men attend Friday prayers in the mosque. Women, however, are typically allowed to pray in private and often do so at home. But for every other measure of religiousness that was included in the Pew surveys, the maps are overwhelmingly orange and gray. So let's look at some more. Here's the map of self-rated importance of religion in the subject's personal lives. Women predominate in 36 countries and men in only 2, Israel and Mozambique. Here's the map for daily prayer. Women predominate in 43 countries, and there is only one tiny speck of blue on the map, which is Israel. And here's the map for religious affiliation. Women predominate in 61 countries, and there is not a single speck of blue on the map. So why is this? Why are women more religious than men? Well, several explanations have been offered, and a few have some supporting evidence, but there is no scientific consensus on this question. I personally think there are several factors behind this gender gap, but the idea of the innate model of the mother suggests a new one that I think may be especially important because it makes some interesting predictions. I call it the crosstalk hypothesis for the greater religiousness of women, and it comes from something I showed you earlier in the orbitofrontal cortex. You may recall that both adult caring for infants and infantile longing for mother come from the same neural circuitry. This strongly suggests that these two behavioral systems should be correlated, that there's crosstalk between them. Individuals with greater empathetic caring as adults should, as infants, also have greater infantile longing for mom. And as adults, greater spiritual longing for God. And this, of course, is because of my central hypothesis that the intensity of spiritual longing in adults is connected to this innate model of the mother, which causes longing for God, longing for mother in infancy. Okay, so that's an important connection here that comes out of this shared neural circuitry in the orbitofrontal cortex. But there's one more critical piece to the puzzle, and that is the observation that women are more caring and nurturing than men. This means that they should have greater spiritual longing than men, which makes them more susceptible to the illusion of God's presence, and therefore more religious than men in the neonatal dimension. And that last part is important because it makes specific predictions. Veneration of God as an infant should have relatively greater appeal for women than for men. On average, women should score higher on the neonatal dimension relative to the social than men. And greater nurturance or empathetic caring as a personality trait should correlate with greater religiousness of the neonatal kind, independent of gender. And I think we can see a fascinating example of this in Francis Collins. He became a Christian early in his career as a physician caring for cancer patients. I think it was his great compassion, not the infamous frozen waterfall, that brought him to Jesus. And this brings us to puzzle number 3. Why do elite scientists believe in God? Years ago, Neil deGrasse Tyson pointed to this puzzle and said there's something else going on that nobody seems to be talking about, something mysterious and alluring about religion that can seduce even the most brilliant of scientific minds. He pointed to these data from a paper in Nature. As of the late 1990s, about 90% of the American public believed in a personal God who answers prayer. For American scientists, however, that number is only about 40%. But if you look at elite scientists, members of the National Academy of Sciences, 93% of them reject belief in a personal God. That was the message of the paper. But Neil's point was that the authors had missed the most exciting and puzzling thing in their data. Namely, why isn't this number 0? Religiosity drops off with increasing scientific training, but it reaches a non-zero asymptote. Why do 7% of the most brilliant scientific minds in the country believe in a personal God? That was Neil's challenge. But he also went on to argue that if we really want to understand this religiousness, if we really want to understand religion as a general phenomenon in human behavior, these scientists are the ones we should be studying, not the general public. Whatever it is that can make believers out of these folks must be the most concentrated essence of the thing we're trying to understand. Now, one suggestion I've heard to try to explain this puzzling 7% is that they must be the ones who had unusually heavy religious indoctrination when they were children, and therefore they had this residual belief in God in adulthood. Now, that idea was not specifically tested in this study of the National Academy of Sciences, but it was examined in this very similar survey of the equally prestigious Royal Society of London. And regarding the 5% of fellows of the Royal Society who believe in God, the authors write, "We also found that, surprisingly, childhood religious upbringing was not significantly related to current attitudes toward religion." Well, this may have surprised the authors, but it doesn't surprise me in the least. My explanation, of course, is that this comes from the neonatal root of religion, and what's seducing these elite scientists is the cognitively impenetrable illusion of God's presence. And again, this makes some testable predictions about what kind of religiousness these 7% should have. Specifically, relative to the 93% of their colleagues who do not believe in God, the puzzling 7% of NAS members should be significantly enriched in people like women, physicians, and others who score high on tests of empathy and nurturance. And relative to those in the general public who do believe in God, the 7% should be significantly enriched in people who identify as spiritual but not religious, which is really just another way of saying that their faith comes mostly from the neonatal root. I'd like to close with one last description of the illusion of God's presence, this one experienced on the moon by astronaut Gene Cernan. We're in a good position to make sense of it now. I was literally standing on a plateau somewhere out there in space, a plateau that science and technology had allowed me to get to. But what I was feeling at that moment in time, science had no answers for. Because there I was, and there you are, the earth, dynamic, overwhelming. And I felt that the world had just too much purpose, too much logic. It was just too beautiful to have happened by accident. There has to be somebody bigger than you and bigger than me. And I mean this in a spiritual sense, not a religious sense. There has to be a creator of the universe who stands above the religions that we ourselves create to govern our lives. Well, first, notice how he rejects the God of the social root, not a religious sense, above religions that govern our lives. Also, we can see in here the God of the gaps, science has no answers, and the argument from design, too beautiful to have happened by accident. But I consider both of those to be mere conscious rationalizations of the powerful intuition that was really behind this experience. And here is that intuition, the certainty that there is somebody bigger. This, I suggest, comes from the innate model of mother. Science does have an answer for this. It hasn't yet been completely tested, but it explains a lot, and it is specific enough that it can be tested. You can learn more about all of this at my website, watheyresearch.com, and of course, even more in my book, The Illusion of God's Presence. Now, in this book, I promise a sequel, a second book, in which I promise to explore in greater detail the neuroscience of human religiousness. That book is coming out next month. It's called The Phantom God, and I will be joining you again on October 23rd to talk about it. And with that shameless plug, I will be happy to take questions. And give me just a second here to unshare my screen. Let's see. I have to navigate my way to that button. Let's see. I'm not sure. Oh, there it is over here. Okay, got it. Okay, so now we should be back to normal, more or less.
Yes, and if anybody has any questions, please raise your hand. I will bring the microphone around to you. Catherine will let me know, and we'll make sure that the microphone gets over to you. And with that, I will start walking towards people.
Okay, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Good. My question is, if the infantile mind is looking for a mother figure, why is it always that God is referred to as a he?
Excellent question. My short answer to that is that it comes from what I briefly talked about as the social root of religion. I didn't really do that subject justice. And I don't mean to suggest in this talk that this idea I have about this neonatal dimension of religion, this infantile aspect, I'm not saying that this explains everything about religion. It does not. It's at most, it's roughly half of what religion is all about. And the other half being this social root of religion. And in that social root of religion, I think is where you'll find the maleness of God. But there is another point I'd like to add, since you brought up this subject. Even in religions that draw their doctrines, their practices, their belief, that draw most of their substance from the social root of religion, those of course tend to be the more authoritarian, sort of patriarchal sort of religions. Even those where God is clearly a male figure. Often, even in those, you'll often see the feminine aspect of God, the maternal, nurturing, loving, forgiving, feminine aspect creeping back into the religion, even if the authorities that be don't want it to. So just to give you one example you will all be familiar with, in Catholicism, which is very much a patriarchal religion, a great many prayers of the faithful are directed not to Jesus or God specifically, but to the Virgin Mary, whom they see as their intercessor. They call her very often the Mother of God, which is just one short, tiny preposition away from Mother God, a God who has a divine figure, a heavenly figure, a supernatural being who has maternal compassion, love, unconditional love, forgiveness, all that stuff. So you can find both dimensions pretty much in every major religion. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. We are now going to be moving on to a virtual question, and then I'll come back to the room. It's a bit of a big one. So does Christianity take advantage of both models? God the Father for the social and Jesus for the mother? Also, does this also explain the oceanic feeling of oneness?
Yes, I would say, well, as I was just saying into the previous question, the distinction of God the Father is at least as most often conceived, God the Father being not just omnipotent, but threatening, judgmental, potentially punishing, fearsome. That aspect of God is not covered by this innate model of the mother. But the other things you mentioned in your question, the supposed forgiving dimension of Jesus and the oceanic feeling of oneness with the universe, yes, I would say this, in my mind at least, is pretty well explained by this innate model of the mother. The feeling of oneness really does, I think, go all the way back to early infancy, both in the sort of oneness that an infant probably feels when held and suckled by nursed by its mother during breastfeeding. But even farther back in time than that, to the feeling of being a fetus in the womb, that truly would be an oceanic experience. So anyway, yes, I think that's where the strength of this hypothesis lies.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you. We are going to go back to questions in the room. So I will pass this off to you.
Hey, thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today in a very informative presentation. So anyway, my question has to do with the assignment of agency to inanimate objects. I've done some little bit of reading about that humans have a evolutionary tendency to see agency and well, I guess agency is the only word I can think to describe it, in things that we know don't actually have it, things like weather or other phenomena. To what degree do you feel that this plays into the assumptions that humans have the tendency to jump towards that God of the gaps?
Yeah, I think that's those two are sort of, in my mind, those are two sides of the same coin. We are extremely good at, as I said, at perceiving intentions in other humans. And when we see something happening that we can't explain, for example, a great example is thunder and lightning, which is a frightening thing. It doesn't happen all that often. When it does happen, it can be scary. It's easy to project that onto some angry super person who maybe even lives up in the sky, since that's where the threat seems to be coming from. We just do that kind of thing naturally. And the innate model of the mother that I'm hypothesizing here is sort of a rudimentary expectation of the existence of a specific human being that fills a critical role and need in the infant survival in the days and weeks right after birth. But it also, I think, serves as the foundation, as I said in the talk, of our general ability to interpret other human beings. It's the foundation for the social part of the human brain. So I think those things are closely tied. And another point, you mentioned the God of the gaps. I think the thing that Francis Collins cites in his book as one of his strongest pieces of evidence for the existence of God is this feeling of God's presence. He pretty much comes out and says that. He basically has two pieces of evidence, or two things that he calls evidence for God's existence. One is this feeling of God's presence. The other has to do with innate tendencies towards human morality, which he says are put there by God. He thinks that this feeling of God's presence comes from, again, something that God put in the human brain. So this, I would argue, is one of the few places left, one of the few big gaps left where it's hard for science to fill the gap, right? And where it's easy for even an eminent scientist like Francis Collins to say, well, science can't answer this, so I'm going to put God in there. One of the things I hope to do with my books is to show that actually science does have something to say about this. There is a natural explanation for this, and it's a test. Unlike the God of the gaps, this one is testable. Maybe it will survive the test, maybe not, but it's a good place to start. So those are my thoughts on that.
Hello. Oh, there we go. Okay. So we are going to take another question from Zoom, but just as a heads up for the Zoomers, is we do need you to type your questions in the chat because everybody in here is not going to be able to hear your question. So if you put it in the chat so then we can read it out loud, then everybody gets to hear your wonderful question and you get it answered. So then I'm going to take this question from Zoom. Can a baby be born with the orbital frontal cortex damaged at birth? And if so, would there be a difference in personality, for an example of narcissism?
My short answer is yes. I think there has been some data on that. Now the example I cited in the talk, there has been a study specifically directed at patients who they actually weren't born without the orbital frontal cortex. They were born with damage to it. Whenever you have an infant born without the orbital frontal cortex, you're going to have more than just the orbital frontal cortex missing. You're probably going to have a lot of other prefrontal areas missing. There are infants born with various degrees or various amounts of cortex incompletely developed. And it's kind of hard to, I think it would be hard to use those as evidence for the points I'm trying to make here. It's really actually more specific and more relevant to have cases where there is specific local damage, like a stroke or whatever, in the orbital frontal cortex in infancy. But the question you raise is interesting for other reasons, which is that when an infant is born with partially developed or underdeveloped cortex, they still show many of the behaviors that we think of as typical of newborn infants. They cry, for example. And because of this, it had long been thought that the cortex of a newborn infant doesn't really do much, that most of what a newborn infant does happens in the brain stem, and crying being one example. But it turns out that more recent evidence shows that this is not correct, that first of all, you can do neural imaging on the cortex of a newborn infant and show that it is indeed active. It responds to stimuli, just as you would expect it to. The auditory cortex responds to sound, the visual cortex responds to visual stimuli, and so on. But also the crying behavior in an anencephalic or microcephalic infant is not normal. It's more a reflexive response to hypothermia, for example, than it is a response to the absence of a person, the absence of mother. So there really is a profound difference between infants with a normal cortex and those without.
Awesome. We are now going to take questions back to the room. So.
Yes. Can you explain how or why people who were non-believers who have had serious accidents and brain damage all of a sudden become very religious?
Yeah, now that's an interesting question. Of course, there are other examples of that. The ones I've read about most and actually talk about a little bit in the book have to do with a syndrome called frontotemporal dementia. Now, this is something, it's not caused by trauma. It's caused by, it's a genetic thing. It's caused by a degeneration similar to Alzheimer's disease, but it tends to start more in the temporal lobes and progress. It happens earlier in life, usually in the 40s rather than 60s or later. And either a change in religiousness or an increase in religiousness is sometimes reported in these patients. All I would say is that it's hard to pin down a good explanation for that, except to say that we seem to have kind of competing processes going on in the brain. There are areas that are skeptical in the brain. Ironically, in the right hemisphere, in the frontal lobe, and what's called the inferior frontal gyrus in the right hemisphere, there's a part of the brain that's involved in skepticism. When you're presenting somebody with a test that probes their belief in kind of flaky things like psychic powers or whatever, that area becomes active in people who are skeptical when they're being skeptical. And if that's, for example, is the place that's damaged, then its effects elsewhere on the brain are diminished. A person can become less skeptical and more likely to interpret the feelings of God's presence or the warm, fuzzy feeling that they get when they walk into a church or whatever as evidence of God's existence. And I will only add, since you brought up this interesting question, I am one of the people who has had that intense, overwhelming feeling of God's presence. I talk about it in the opening pages of chapter 1. And when I had it, it was dramatic. It was palpable. I felt I could almost reach out and touch it. It only lasted for a few tens of seconds, and it did not, for a minute, make me think that God was real. But I could easily understand and easily empathize with people who do take it as evidence for God's existence. It has a very otherworldly feeling to it. And I guess the fact that I had written a book about it, or was in the process of writing a book about it at the time, that may have helped me resist its pull.
Is amazingly interesting. Thank you.
There I am. I have been reading a book. It's at least for a year, and I'm starting over soon, by Robert Sapolsky, Behave. Your talk seems to mesh very well with his take on the human brain. And I just like your comment on that. And
Oh, yes.
go on.
Well, I'm just going to say that I have to apologize for not having read the book. So I'm kind of at a loss to comment. I've heard of him. I've had him recommended to me, and I've seen a few video clips of him speaking on YouTube. I know a little bit about his ideas. If there's some specific thing he talks about that you want to relate to my talk, I could maybe comment on that.
Well, I do remember him referring to the fusiform, the very first part of the brain you showed.
Yes, the face
He
area.
says
Yes.
The facial, what do you call it? Facial?
Yeah, the fusiform face area, and the syndrome when it's damaged is called prosopagnosia, or face blindness.
Oh, okay. Face blindness is what.
Yeah.
And then I've had a lot of experiences that if I were religious, I would think I was in God's presence. But at the time, I just realized what I felt was that I was exactly where I was supposed to be at the time I was supposed to be there. Now, I know that sounds a little woo-woo, but it's like I was where I was.
Yeah.
In nature, that happens a lot.
Oh, yeah, I've had those feelings too. I know exactly what you mean there.
Yes, and I think that must be something similar.
Yes, I think so. I'm a backpacker. I love being in nature. I get my exercise mostly by hiking in a park that's not too far from where I live. I love going up to the mountains, and I do have those moments where suddenly I just feel like I'm home. I have the feeling that everything's familiar. I belong here. I'm part of nature. This is what the world is supposed to be like. Not all paved and buildings and cars, but trees and animals and flowing streams and things like that. But it's not in words that it's happening. It's just this feeling of belongingness, of almost being part of it. And yeah, I think that's very much coming from the same part of the brain, the same kind of thing.
Thank you. I am going to take a question from Zoom. So yes. Thanks for a very enlightening and interesting talk. You spoke of the God vacuum that needs to be filled. If I remember it correctly, humans are social primates, which means that throughout evolution, we depend on our brothers and sisters to survive. In essence, our extended families were our safe harbors. We now depend on money and law to survive, thus we exist without our brothers and sisters, our safe harbors. Could what we imagine God to be as an entity that provides the safe harbor that throughout evolution our brothers and sisters provided?
That is a fascinating question. I think the short answer to that is probably yes. It is true that we can be much more separated from our fellow humans than we would have been if we were part of a hunter-gatherer tribe. And probably the most dramatic example of that a lot of us experience is growing up in the so-called nuclear family, a little house in the suburbs, mom and dad run everything. One parent goes off to work, the other takes care of the kids. And that's actually turns out to be, in the context of human evolution, a very abnormal way of raising kids. What was normal is what you just described, having an extended family around you and close familial connections and friends and always interacting with people. And all of us have been through, because of the pandemic, a almost 2-year period of that kind of isolation on steroids. So yes, I think that religion could conceivably, part of the drive, the success of religion could be that it does fill some of that gap. It fills some of that hole for people.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. All right, I'm gonna do an eeny, meeny, miny, mo. We can do 2. We can do those 2, and then we're gonna be done. Just maybe not like take up 5 to 10 minutes of asking a question. I'd really appreciate it.
In Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, he talks about the default mode network and how people under the influence of psychedelic drugs believe sometimes that they've had a religious experience and seen God. Does that fit into your theories?
I haven't read his book. I'm not sure what his argument is, but I have actually read some of Michael Pollan's work. I admire him greatly, and at least in what I've read of him has to do with his ideas on how, as a person, we can cope with global warming or help to combat the problem. That one is fascinating. I do, in my second book, the one I'll be talking about in October, I have a chapter about hallucinogenic drugs. My take on hallucinogens there is a little bit different from the usual. But what the point I try to make there is that hallucinogenic drugs interfere with the connection between the senses and our conscious experience. And you may remember earlier in my talk, I said that perception comes not only from sensory input, but also from what the brain expects. And it's that balance between those two sources of information, between the top-down information coming from higher cognitive centers and the bottom-up information flowing from the senses. That balance is being screwed up in some way by hallucinogenic drugs. They're sort of disconnecting or weakening the sensory input and enhancing the brain's expectations. So what you're experiencing in a hallucinogenic drug is something that's tuned a little bit by whatever's in the sensory environment around you, but is largely coming from your own internal expectations, not necessarily conscious expectations, but from somewhere in your brain, something is giving you perceptions that aren't out there in reality, and that's a hallucination. What I try to argue in my book on this subject is that even without hallucinogenic drugs, that balance between top-down and bottom-up information can be altered. For example, in sensory deprivation, or like the woman in the picture crying in desperation, holding her head in her hands. That's a kind of sensory deprivation. So I guess that's the best I can do without having read Pollan's book at answering your question.
Thank you. All right, now on to our final question.
I saw that you charted out the different religions based on whether they were social or innate alignment. And I'm wondering if there's a way to correlate or find out the correlation between that and the characteristics of human thriving or flourishing. Is there any research that you're aware of that already looks at that level of correlation?
Oh, great. Another fascinating question. I off the top of my head, I cannot think of that specific thing. It's not an issue I specifically looked for and wrote about, but I know there must be a gazillion studies of some aspects of human flourishing and correlating that with religious belief. My guess is they are not going to get at the question you raise, because this distinction I've tried to draw between the infantile dimension of religion and the social root of religion is not one that's really been compared that much in the psychological study of religion. Like I said, it's kind of a new thing. My psychometric test for it hasn't been tested by psychologists yet, hasn't been validated by psychologists yet. It actually needs some validation and testing. So I guess the short answer is no, I'm not aware of that, but there must be some studies relevant to that.
And that's all the time that we have, but I just want to say thank you so much to our speaker today. That was fantastic. It was informative, entertaining. We greatly appreciated it.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Very much looking forward to seeing you again in October.